Good afternoon. Welcome. I would like to welcome you all to another talk in SIGA seminar series. Today, my name is Ömer Taşgetir and I am a faculty member in Political Science and International Relations Department at Yaqoob University. Today our speaker is Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed. I want to give his biography before he starts his talk. Dr. Yaqoob Ahmed is a PhD graduate from the Department of Languages and Cultures, School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London. His thesis was on the role of the Ottoman ulema during the Constitutional Revolution of 1908 and Counter-Revolution of 1909. He's currently teaching Islamic history at Istanbul University, Faculty of Theology, and he was also a visiting fellow at Modern Turkish Studies Center at Istanbul Şehir University. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual thought in the 19th and 20th centuries, Islamic constitutionalism, identity and collective memory construction. And today he will give us a talk on the struggle for political legitimacy in the Middle East. Welcome, Dr. Yaqoob, and please help me welcome Dr. Yaqoob.
Can I introduce the mic? Yes, no? I just...
Mic.
What mic? You want the mic?
Mic.
Yes. The mic for...
Speaking.
Ah, it's been... that one? Is that one? Is that one?
No, there's no... This one working? No,
Okay. All right. So, Assalamu alaikum. Many of you probably don't know who I am. Yes, I am a strange... oh, there we go. Strange academic in this country. We historians generally are not often given the opportunity to talk about matters to do with politics. And yet it's often my opinion that if only political scientists studied more history, then maybe we might be able to understand our realities and the world that we're living in. By default, us historians, not by choice, but just because of our inquisitive nature, start to understand the world around us. And so I myself, by default, become invested in the Muslim world, simply because as a Muslim, I'm interested in what's going to happen in that context. My PhD was on the role of the Ottoman ulema during the Constitutional Revolution of 1908 and Counter-Revolution of 1909. I write my PhD from a particular angle in which I emphasize on decolonial studies in particular, because it is my belief that Ottoman studies, to some degree, hasn't escaped the colonial yoke in the manner in which it's written. So in that context, I'm quite different than most Ottoman academics. I was looking at the idea of revolution and the inception of the idea of revolution in regards to Islamic political leadership, the legitimization of revolution and how the language works in that context, the idea of language and symbolism, the manner in which the ulama supported revolutionary activity, the manner in which ulama went against the idea of revolutionary activity, and so you start to see a complexity that exists in the Muslim world. In my period in particular, we have a Khalifa, so it makes it even more unique. It's not an idea of revolution against the nation state, it's a revolution against the Caliph himself. And so that's what I was looking at in that context. I then started to look at the idea of the construction of a constitution, the idea of a caliphate having a constitution, which is a new theory in that context. We look at the works of Muwardi and so forth, but very little people look at the works of Mustafa Sabri, Hamdi Yazar, and so forth. And so what I did is I tried to draw on that by saying that why has the memory of these ulama, this period in particular, been forgotten? We remember people like Sabri in the nation-state context. So we remember Sabri in Egypt, we remember Mustafa Sabri in Turkey. Sabri is a hard person to understand because someone like me had to trace him from Ottoman, Turkish and Arabic. So it wasn't just one language set, it was two language sets. And then he moves around a lot, which is the nature of empire, the nature of the ulama in that context. But he's not the only one. You see a consensus. And so I look at the ulama as a consensus body, not an individual alim per se, but how did they legitimize this as a consensus body of the idea of having a constitution which would hold authority to account. So then you start to see the debates of Shura, Meshweret, Adala, and then the ideas of the French revolutionary ideas. And then I look at things like language. So how do you take the idea of freedom and translate that to hurriya or hurriyat? Does it carry the same epistemology? Does it have the same genealogy? Or is it, once we translate words from English or French into our own native languages, what I call the Islamicate languages, what happens is we internalize these words in different ways. And a major argument I've had is that English is not an Islamicate language. I sit on that quite aggressively. Now, the possibility of English becoming an Islamicate language is something that we can debate later, but right now in that period, in the 19th century, you see from Albanian to Malay, from Chinese to Ottoman Turkish to Persian to Arabic, there is a particular script that's being used, and there's a particular language that's understood across the board in the Islamicate world. In that context, you start to see that English, as a language, as a tool for secularism, has been quite dominant and effective. And so as an academic, once again, I'm a decolonialist academic in terms of the way history functions. Even though I wrote a PhD in English, I'm well aware of the sort of problem areas English has as a medium in trying to explain Islamic experiences. And it's not only the issue of words that are translated, it's words that are not translated in English. So I've said this to my students before, words like salah translate as prayer, but they don't translate correctly, unfortunately. But namaz does, because it's an Islamicate language, so it knows how to do it, because it has a history and a tradition. It works with that. Zakat is not charity, you know that. But then there are other words that don't translate. The West choose not to translate, like jihad. There's a reason why you don't translate jihad, because you might allow the thinker to assume that preemptive warfare, or what's happening in the Western world, might actually correlate with what the picture that's been painted with Muslims. So by not translating this term particularly, you leave it dirty and messy. The inability to know what's happening. So translation here is quite powerful. So this is one of the things that I was looking at in my work, although not an active issue of my work, but just to let you guys know what it is, what I'm doing, and why then I have a position to have an opinion to talk about things which are more contemporary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this presentation down into 3 segments. I'm going to first look at the idea of the modern nation state. I'll then look at the concept of secularism as a tool for the modern nation state. And then we'll talk about the issue of legitimacy and the power struggles that take place regarding legitimacy in the Muslim world in general, but more so since the so-called Arab Spring, in terms of the impact that this has on us as Muslims in that context. So my idea is kind of strange. So deep down I'm a child at heart, and I used to watch Back to the Future and I loved it. And one of the reasons why I like that movie is because of envisaging the future, the possibility of what the future could look like. And so flying cars, hoverboards, text message. One of the interesting things about Back to the Future too is they got text messaging right, they got the fax machine right, they got the microwave right. What they got wrong was that people wear 2 ties and that cars will be flying. But the idea, the concept of being able to envisage a future is something which intrigued me when I was watching science fiction as a child. Quite recently I went to the cinema to watch Blade Runner. Once again I found that movie intriguing. This time the future has been envisaged in the sense of as a dystopia. What can go wrong? The idea of memory construction, the idea of artificial intelligence, the idea of human beings playing God. And this intrigued me once again, that in the West there is a capacity to try to envisage a particular future. For me, what concerns me is why do Muslims not try to exercise this possibility of an alternate future? Why is it that we've become stagnated in the present with the inability to have the possibility of pushing the boundaries? And so why I'm asking this question, and my presentation will be a series of questions to you, not many answers, I'm afraid. One, mainly because I don't have the answers myself. What I'm trying to encourage is a debate within the Muslim communities to try to see what our future could be like. The fact that we don't even think it is problematic to me, because the idea is that we're not even allowed to think it. So forget even vocalizing it. That's too radical. It's the idea of even thinking the thought of a possible or alternate worldview is something which has become problematic. And for me, I say let's think it, at least. Let's debate it, let's talk about it. And so for me, when I look at the idea of the nation state, that's what I'm going to talk about. I want to envisage a possibility of an alternative to the nation state. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe the nation state is here forever, maybe. Maybe not. But the idea of thinking about the possibility is something I think we should consider, because the nation state wasn't always here, right? So someone like myself, who's an Ottoman historian, I can tell you that first the Ottomans started off as a small principality, and rather than looking at the Ottomans as an empire, just look at the shifting natures of government, because that's what happened. Small principality, then the Istanbul government, okay, and then it becomes this idea of empire, then it's first Sultan to Istanbul first, then there's the fratricide, then there's the rise of the Janissaries as an institutional challenge, so we call that the Second Empire, and then there's the modernization period, in which we call constitutionalism in the modern context. The empire is consistently changing and evolving its political models as a way of surviving, as a survival mechanism. And it managed to achieve that for 400, 500, 600 years, which is phenomenal in that context. What you see in the Ottoman context, which I also found interesting, is when the formations of the nation states were happening, many of the Muslim thinkers were freaking out. They were afraid of the possibility of the trauma and the violence the idea of a secularized nation state would bring. Now, going back 100 years, and now looking at their work, I would have to say that they were quite right in what they were perceiving about the future. They envisaged the future, they envisaged the possibility of the collapse of an empire, they envisaged what could come out from that empire, and one of the fears they had was ethnic tensions, the dominance of the West over the non-West, and the idea that Islam, in terms of its political agency, would be lost. Okay, for the Ottomans in that context, the loss of the empire and the Khilafah in particular was the loss of Islam, which is not something we feel anymore. But in my work, I see that evidently. When you look at the works of Mustafa Sabri, he's freaking out. He's saying if the empire goes, Islam goes with it, right? And it's, then you start to realize how they understand Deen, which is not religion, the Europeanized understanding of what Islam should be. It's a worldview in that context. So these are some of the questions that I'm trying to pose. Now I believe, my personal opinion, is that the nation state is in trouble. That's my personal opinion, okay? I think the nation state is in trouble, especially in the Muslim world, but I think the nation state is in trouble in the West as well. All right? It's finding it difficult to sustain the model. Now one of the interesting things about the nation state in particular is its ability to construct in the minds of the citizens of the nation state that this model is progress. Okay, and that we as human beings are the most progress people since the beginning of time. And so what we've achieved in terms of progress is actually the pinnacle of human achievement. In that sense, the idea that something that comes out of this idea of progress could be negative is not plausible for people. What they'll say is that people are getting it wrong, but the model is a good model, it can work. But I find that model problematic in many ways, and I'll explain why. So when you construct a nation state in the Muslim context, all our nation states were constructed from a period of violence. Not only is it from a position of violence, it's constructed by the colonial powers, apart from Turkey, which self-colonized itself. But the rest of the nation states, to some degree, it was colonial powers who decided to draw up these nations as a way of managing the Muslim world. This is what it was an issue of management. This is how we're going to manage these people, right? And I'm going to have that, and you're going to have that, and that's how it's going to work. The fact that the Western powers were doing this with the nation states, and then we internalized that in some ways as a victory for us, as a way of constructing our identity, for me as a historian is bizarre, really. It's the weirdest thing when I look back in time. As a moment of trauma, we create it as a moment of celebration. And what we did is we constructed memories, and so I call this collective memories, right? If we keep saying something over and over, it must be right, is what happens in our nation state. It's great, it's amazing, it's great, it's amazing, democracy, democracy, democracy. If we keep saying it, it must be right because we just kept saying it. But it's not only the idea of the constructed collective memory that the nation state achieved. It's the collective amnesia. There was a way of creating a constructed collective amnesia. We forgot stuff. We forgot stuff about the Ottoman Empire. We forgot our struggles. We forgot our pains. We forgot actually the trauma of what the nation state was about. And that for me is twice as interesting, which means that power, literacy, and now the internet have a way of creating a constructive amnesia where we forget the past. Let's look at the Syrian situation. The Syrian situation is interesting for me because people no longer remember the reign of Hafez al-Assad or Bashar al-Assad. What they remember is the trauma right now. right? And so now they look at that period as a period of, that was great. It wasn't great because I used to live there, I know, right? Two wrongs don't make a right. Okay, we have combustion right now, but even in that period, it wasn't great. So what happens is you have this period of amnesia that's created in your mind because of trauma. Trauma does that. So you want to forget stuff as a collective. And then what you need to do is you need to create a memory. Now the nation state's memory is very short, 60, 70, 80 years. Islam's memory, however, predates that. So how do you construct a memory where you have the majority of your nationals or citizens to have an identity that predates this nation-state identity? Well, one you have to do is you have to predate that identity. So in Egypt's case, you go back to the pharaohs. In Turkey's case, you go back to the first Turk that was ever born, and so forth. This idea of going back in time that predates Islam. In that sense, what you see is Islam, as an idea, is a decentralizing force for the nation-state. It's problematic for it. Not only is Islam problematic in terms of deconstructing the idea of a nation-state, so is the concept of ummah. The idea of ummah, which transcends borders in many ways, in shapes and forms, also decentralizes the idea of the nation-state, because belonging to the ummah is actually quite complicated. And it shouldn't be black and white. It shouldn't have to be the way we understand citizens of the nation-state. It should be blurry, because that's what the community is. And the strange thing about the community of belonging to the ummah is there's an ummah you belong to from the past, and there's an ummah you belong to now, and there's going to be an ummah you belong to in the future. Can you envisage a nation-state citizen like that? It's difficult. And so when we have our tradition, Rasulullah is saying, ummati, ummati, who's he actually talking about? Is he talking about the ummah of his time, or is he talking about ummah of the future? Now this is internalized in Muslim communities, right? So within the Muslim community, there's an idea of belonging to a fraternity that transcends time and space. Once again, that has a decentralizing capacity of the nation-state. Of course it does. And so now when you look at Islam, its history, and the Ummah, all three components are going after the nation-state organically, actually. They're not trying to do it. It's just the nature of the beast of what it is. So in that context, once again, I think that the modern nation-state for Muslims is going to be problematic. How do you facilitate that? Even in this country, the mass Syrian migration. What are you going to do? Syrians are here to stay, let's just accept that now. Okay, they're not going anywhere, they've got nothing to go back to. And they're going to challenge the idea of what it means to belong to this nation state. Of course they are. Because they're just organically going to do that. Because the minute you call them as part of the Ummah, this dialectic struggle takes place. And then, you know, Turks who've never had falafel before are going to have to get used to falafel. It's just here, it's here to stay. So is the Arabic. So one of the interesting things that I find is the way the Arabic was purged out of the Turkish language is naturally going to come back. You have no choice, right? And this is how societies function. This is how migration, in some ways, war, destruction, migration, actually impacts the nature of fixed boundaries, fixed ethnicity, and being a citizen of a particular state in that context. So for me, then, I am saying that the manner in which the nation state was built, in the Muslim world in particular, was a military state, about trying to safeguard resources. And there's only so far you can go with that. Now, the nation state's idea is based on a secular nation state. So secularism, for me, is interesting. We shouldn't look at secularism within the context of the nation state. We should look at secularism as a worldview. Every single state is a secular state. We live in a world of a secularized world. And it's hard for us to envisage anything beyond that because we have now become accustomed to having a secularized consciousness. To some degree, every single one of us is being impacted by secularism in some shape or form. We can't deny that. You have to go to really deep places in your mind to try to deconstruct that. Okay, so it's really hard for us to see the possibility of having a political vision which is different from the political vision of secularism. In that sense, one of the interesting things that I find is that Islam's and religion in the pre-modern period anyway was designed to give you salvation in this life and the next life. This ideal salvation. A sense of purpose for mankind and human beings. That you have a purpose of why you're here. And that purpose to some degree is important. Because when you have a purpose, no matter how difficult life is, you keep going. You're fine. It's not going to be forever. And so forth. The modern generation has this life and the next life and the life on the phone too. They seem to be fixated on the third world that they live in, which scares me immensely, actually. I used to joke with my students when I went to Malaysia that if you were the generation of Rasul Sallam, you would never have the Quran, because after Alif Lam Mim, you just go to your phones and nobody would listen anymore. What happens? And this scares me a little bit. But what you see then, in terms of the secularized world, is secularism was supposed to, in the European context, give people salvation from religion. Right? Religion was a problem. It was abusive, king and church. So we need to somehow give you salvation from these people who are abusing you. Now when you have this idea, and it becomes globalized in virtually every state and every person, then religion naturally becomes problematic. Hence Islam is always going to be problematic. And so when I go to all these Islamophobia conferences, one of the things that sticks to me all the time, so long as you have secularism, you will have Islamophobia. Because the nature of secularism is to look at religion from a superior perspective, and to, in some ways, try to validate it, regulate it, control it. Islam in that context is, in some ways, going against the secular model in some shape or form. And you can't be surprised then that in the United States of America, in Europe, in India, in Burma, that Muslims are facing a sense of subjugation, because the power groups, which are the religious groups, they have made a relationship with secularism to some degree. So secularism hasn't removed religion. What is allowed is a negotiation between religious groups and the power to exist. So in the case of Europe, it's a negotiation between Christianity and the European powers, or the West, in that context, right? So we celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December, but we don't actually celebrate Eid or Bailam. It will never happen. Okay, maybe we get a day off from work, but this idea is not going to happen. What you start to see then is generally Christians feel, to some degree, in the secularized form that is, that they have a right and an opinion to how the world should be run in Western Europe and the United States of America. In that sense, the rise of the right, with a Christian identity to some degree, is always going to look at Islam and Muslims from that particular lens. So Muslims are going to be a victim of that. That's no different than Hinduism. The Hindutva ideology is a negotiation between Hindus who are in power in India, who have made a negotiation within the secular system, accepted it, and then have found Muslims problematic. The same thing in Burma, where the Buddhists, the peaceful Buddhists, now they have made a negotiation with a secular regime and state of trying to be in power. And who do they subjugate? The other, which is the Muslims. So in that sense, you see from the external component in the nation state that Islam is always going to have an issue, because Islam is continuously contesting the nation state, either in ideology or by the Muslim just existing. Okay, your visibility as a Muslim, to some degree, is a contestation of secularism. Not necessarily in the political sphere, but in the public sphere. Okay, so secularism has now got deeper down into mainstream society, where it's no longer just about politics, it's about your visibility in the public space. Headscarves, beards, mosques, so forth. People in England shouldn't be worried about mosques if all they're concerned about is the political sphere. So what are they concerned about? It's the visibility. It's the visibility of Muslims. And so this is why I'm then saying, it's this idea or this notion of a secularized consciousness that exists in the world, which has given it the right to have a superiority in some ways about how the world should be looked at, how the world should be governed, and any alternative to that will face a form of violence. This violence can be intellectual, this violence can be psychological, or this violence can be F-16s and bombs to try to give you democracy. But it will happen, because this is exactly how it's functioning. And in that sense, when you live in a secularized world, what you have to do to some degree is demonize something, and in this case it's Islam. And in the Muslim context, Islamism is the name that's given to that. Okay, the context of these political crazies who are going to do something and take us down. And so in that sense, the nation state is interesting because it's built on an assumption of fears. The nation state always has to create a fear. Let's look at the Israeli state. The Arabs are coming, the Muslims are coming, the Palestinians are coming, and if they're not coming, then you can't actually unite the Israelis together on a common cause. I know, because I've been there. Okay, and that's not the only nation that does that. Other nations use the idea the Islamists are coming. Other nations use the idea of the possibility, look what we gave you. We gave you stability, we gave you money, and so forth, we're going to lose it. So in some shape or form, even in England, when you look at it, or in the United States of America, look what we've achieved, and we're going to lose that. So fear is an important component in today's modern nation state as a way of disciplining society. And so in that context, to have democracy, it requires security. And for you to have security, it means that liberal notions of society need to go, and we need to regulate society. And at this moment in time, the only demon that can be accepted in the West and non-West is Islam. That's how it's functioning, that's how it is. Now, it could come across that I'm being quite emotional as a Muslim, possibly. I can give you that. But as an academic and somebody who's taken a step back, I'm pretty convinced, I'm pretty certain of my position, and it's going to be very hard to shift me away from that. So then what do we do? Okay? And let's look at the idea of secularism. It's not only trashing people, it's trashing the world, it's trashing the environment, it's giving people the access to have no emotion in the manner in which they treat human beings. The idea of having a transcendent component to the lives of human beings is the idea that there's a form of accountability. You're accountable to something. Okay, when that form of accountability is taken away from the individual, from society, and from the state, then we are the ones who decide what's acceptable accountability and what not. And in that context, when that component is not there, infused within your state, society, and individual, when it's not there, then the manner in which human beings demonize and choose to otherize people can be quite problematic, right? In that context, you can see that Islam is an exception here in some ways, and in the manner in which it looks at societies. Now, somebody will say that abuses happen in the Muslim world and so forth. Of course they do. Of course they do. I'm not disputing that. But the violence that this new secular world has shown is, for me, in my experience, unparalleled. And as a historian, and if it's not unparalleled, if this has been happening since the beginning of time, well, you promised me something different. You promised me that secularism will be better than the past. You promised me that secularism will be better than religion and religious violence. But it hasn't been better. It's been the same, if not worse. So in that context, once again, I'm asking you to think and envisage a possibility of a different future, if that's possible. We may not be able to enact on it now, but think about it. Look at the art, look at the buildings, look at the internet, look at everything around you, and you can see that how secularism has touched it and turned it exceptionally violent. There's nothing in it. It's scary for me. The buildings I look at, they're soulless. I complain about my belediye. In Turkey they have this idea, belediye çalışıyor, it's like just working. It's constant concrete coming over and over. They trashed the tree outside my house. I was going insane. So that tree's been there for 60 years, what are you doing? And he goes, that's my job, Yani, what do you expect? I say, fear Allah. He goes, oh yeah, you fear Allah. And that's how it goes on. But you start to see, right, that this idea of the secularized consciousness, it doesn't even care about the environment that we're in and things around us. It's just constant trash, trash, trash. And someone will say to me that, you know, this is just an idealistic view you have of religion. Maybe, maybe. But we tried your alternative. Maybe it's time to think about mine. And my alternative has been here prior to your alternative in many ways. It's been here for 1400 years and it's survived. There must be something in it. If we can use the morality of Islam, for me as an individual, for me of how to interact with my maker, for me to how to interact with my neighbor, my friend, my cat, then surely Islam can tell me something about my community and my politics. It should, right? It should have a component of telling us how our politics should be. And the fact that it's not telling us, it's not the fact that it's not telling us, it's the fact that we're not listening. Because we're choosing not to. Because we're choosing not to be brave enough to say it, and we're choosing not to be brave enough to think it. Now, the idea was about legitimacy, so let's talk about that, because I have 5 minutes. In the Arab Middle East, one of my concerns, you have 10 minutes? 5 more extra minutes, thank you very much. One of the things that I noticed in my PhD was that after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, or the Ottoman Devlet in that context, depends on how you want to see it, you see that the ulama gave up on the political vision. And the ulama in particular, who were seen as the bastions of Islam in some shape or form, in the manner in which it's practiced and in the manner in which it's conceptualized. To some degree there is a feeling that they gave up on this political vision of what we can do next. And so what they did is they left a vacuum for that vision to be filled by other actors, naturally. Now I'm not saying every alim did that, but on a general basis there is a feeling amongst certain thinkers and the younger generation that the ulama are no longer providing solutions to the political problems they are facing locally, translocally, transnationally, and geopolitically. Now we are turning to experts in that field. And it's fine, we live in a world now where expertise matters. But the fact that on many occasions there is a belief that the ulama no longer are interested in politics to some degree, because apparently politics is dirty, is the fact that it seems that all they're interested in is maintaining the tradition. The tradition is political. It's been political from its inception. And those of us who go back into history and keep reading the works of the ulama, they have political opinions. They have opinions of petitioning to the leader, and they have models in which they expect the construction of the state apparatus should be. The fact that this is not clear anymore is problematic to me. And so what you start to see in the modern context is a vacuum of Islamist movements who then try to fill that void to some shape or form as a way of obtaining power, because there was a belief that maybe they could achieve this change. And when I was a young kid, growing up in England, we heard all sorts of movements, and there was a belief that this could happen. But now in 2018, there is a belief that something's changed. I find it strange that after all the criticisms I've given you about the nature of the secular nation state, why the Nahda would give up on the idea of Islam and play the game of the secular nation state. I find it problematic in that context that on many occasions I believe that the reason why many of the Islamist movements failed is either they didn't understand Islam or they didn't understand the reality. One of the two, or maybe both. Now this is a harsh statement coming from me as an individual, right? Who am I on my high horse to make this opinion? I'm a Muslim who's a historian and maybe shouldn't have this opinion, but I do because I'm part of the Ummah in this context. And I think, and I'm concerned and I'm worried. And the fact that I continuously engage with people of that background who are unwilling to see that the world is changing is scary to me. Because the speed in which the world is changing and the inability to understand how quickly it's changing and the inability to understand that the youth more and more are becoming disenfranchised by them and Islam is problematic for me. Because somewhere down the line we are not given a vision of what the youth should subscribe to or aspire to. We are failing here then, in this context. And what the youth see then is constant violence in the Middle East. Continual violence over and over, over and over. And why should they subscribe to that? They want to be out. So you start to see this brain drain that's taking place. Them going off to Europe and the United States and not coming back. That concerns me. And so what you start to see is this contestation where the secular forces are trying to maintain the models of secularism in some shape or form in the name of reform. Because that's what we need as Muslims. We just continuously need reform. Okay? And then those who are in opposition to it, who had some sort of post-colonial, decolonial component to them, have given up on that as a way of just accepting the nature of the boundaries they are in, with the possibility of surviving in the now. What about the future? What does the future hold? And what possibilities will you give for the future? So if you're a member of the Muslim Brotherhood who lives in Turkey, forget Egypt. You now live in Turkey. Help them. Give them solutions. Give them possibilities. I'm not saying you don't have ideas about Egypt, but this is one of the things I found strange, of this obsession of still sitting within your own nation-state framework. You're a Muslim in many ways. You should have an international approach to the world in terms of having a vision for everybody that you interact with. It shouldn't be localized in that context. And that's a little harsh in the Brotherhood, to be fair, because the manner in which violence is being executed on them is unacceptable. Okay? And one could argue that maybe they could have achieved success if that violence had not come. But to some degree, that's the nature of the environment we're in. That's the nature of the nation state and the manner in which it executes violence. And so, why are we assuming that we're going to be any different when the structure in the system is what promotes and legislates that? Okay, total disconnect in that context. And that's what concerns me. What concerns me is there is a concern of the execution of violence from non-Muslims. But the day the execution of violence happens from Muslims, it's a sad day. Because then we gave up on our concepts of justice, on deen, on taqwa, and so forth. And that's not how we should operate. And this is why I keep saying, in the Ottoman context, when they say that the state was built on the component of deen and taqwa, that's important. When the concept of adala is important as a component, what does that mean? Justice isn't universal. Justice isn't the same. So whose justice are they talking about? When they're talking about institutional checks and balances from the conception of Islam, what do they mean? Who are they talking about? And this is important for us to start to understand not only then the past that I'm talking about, but the possible future in that context. So this is the way I'm looking at it. We live now in what political scientists will say is a post-Islamist world. Fine, if we've accepted that Islamism in its context, in its component now, to some degree has failed to achieve its objective, and that maybe it's possible to ask that Muslim political movements now will not be able to achieve what they had achieved in the 60s, 70s and 80s, then what's the future? Is there a possibility of thinking beyond even the Islamist models that we have in the region? And I think this is something we need to start considering. Maybe the Islamist models just need some sort of shake-up and we can go again, I don't know. But there has to be a lot of soul-searching in that context. So that's how I see it. So I'm going to now wrap up. I know it sounds strange for many people for a historian to come here and talk like this. I'm not now talking in my capacity as a historian. I'm talking in my capacity as a Muslim. Okay, I'm not afraid or embarrassed of being a Muslim. I'm not afraid or embarrassed of standing in Western academia and admitting that. I'm concerned about what's happening in the Muslim world, not only now but for the future. And so these are some of my projections in terms of what I see. And this is why I honestly believe that collectively it's okay to say we don't know, in my opinion. It's okay. We don't know. That's fine. If you don't know, then how do we know? Is the way that I want to conceptualize it. Let's start thinking. So maybe I haven't given you what you were hoping in that context. And like I said, it was a series of questions which I was going to ask you. But I'm now going to end it here because I think I've gone over my time. And yeah, the floor is open to you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Yaqoob. You offered your reflections on a number of thoughts. They are important and they are a good starter for a discussion. And there are lots of things to talk about, actually. You made lots of points about different issues, about how Muslims should deal with the modern world. I rather going to ask you a question about, and I have a number of questions, but I also want to have the audience, take questions from the audience. My question about secularism, you presented it as a more like worldview, and that is it is something common in the Muslim world. You know, people living in Turkey know what secularism means, how it creates lots of problems for our societies. But at the same time, there is as you know, you mentioned the term post-Islamist. People say the AKP, early AKP is an example of a post-Islamism. And we see the post-Islamism in the case of Rashid Khan, which is the Nahda movement. And post-Islamism, to some extent, post-Islamism is about secularization, in a sense. It means like coming to terms with the diversity of the society, that an Islamic a politics based on a politics of identity doesn't work in a diverse society. So we need to change our discourse and we need to embrace, we need to shift towards a politics of service as opposed to a politics of ideology. So what do you think about this model? Okay, and I also personally agree with all this, your vision about secularism, but at the same time, the idea of how people live together, how people should come to terms, how the Muslim rulers should deal with the diversity in their societies, and that directly speaks to the question of legitimacy. What should be the standards of legitimacy in these societies in 2018? Obviously, you studied the classical Islamic political thought. At the same time, our context is different. So, do you think this model, and what are your ideas on that? Thank you.
That's a loaded question. Look, I mean, I think when it comes to legitimacy in the Muslim world, I think Muslim leaders lost that legitimacy a long time ago. I mean, the idea that they are now going to try to pose a question of how they can be legitimate is problematic. In the sense of secularism, look, I'm not talking about the nature of the secular in this context. I'm explaining in some ways, no different than someone like Khaldak or someone like Tawal Asad in some ways, or Sabah Mahmoud, which is this idea that the viewpoint of having a worldview in which Allah no longer exists, right? There's no longer God. In terms of human beings take the agency in this context. And there's some of human beings is always going to lead to istibdad. Always. Because human beings just do not have the capacity, for those of you, absolutism. Okay. Human beings don't have the capacity to move away from absolutism. Whether it's a structure, whether it's an individual, or whether it's us as a collective, we're always going to execute absolutism if we are left to our own devices. In that sense, you need some sort of counter check and balance on that. Now, usually in the past, what happened was religion had a moral authority to be able to do that. Okay. Now, religion doesn't have that space. Right? It doesn't have that space anymore because religion is being subjugated. Because its moral vision is being perceived as being problematic. It cannot provide that moral vision. It cannot give you that moral vision anymore. And I just disagree with that fundamentally, because when I look at the manner in which the secularized world functions, whether you look at the internet, institutions, large corporations, China, Burma, the United States of America, I don't see one instance where secularism to some degree has helped the furthering of humanity. Instead, what I've seen is constant management, micromanagement, and destruction. The war in Syria happened on the watch of secularism, by the way. All right, I really need to remember that. The Palestinian subjugation happened on the watch of secularism. The killing of Burmese or the genocides in Rwanda happened under the watch of secularism. And the bombs that drop on people are not religious bombs, by the way, they're secular. Designed by secular institutions and countries who have no emotion in the manner in which human beings die. So we can kill 10,000 human beings with knives, that's okay, but if it's chemical, it's problematic. It tells you how we're viewing the nature of human beings, where human life is not sacred, it's just a number. That's how we view people now, numbers, stats, figures. Because that's what happens when you take away the emotion of the transcendent, when you take away the idea of the concept of the spirit, when you ridicule the notion of the idea of the spirit, that the spirit is irrelevant, when you continuously bash away of the idea that religion in itself is a joke, then this is what you end up with. You end up with this sort of like barrage of aggression, which cannot be controlled or regulated. And in that sense, someone asked me, let's talk about the practical sense, why are you still philosophizing? Because for me, that's what's missing. That's what's exactly missing in human beings, this philosophy, this vision, this morality. We've allowed secularism to monopolize morality in the way that morality should be. And then we've become embarrassed of presenting an Islamic alternative to morality, to ethics, to philosophy, to ideology. Ideology has become a dirty word for us. I don't understand why, in many ways. I mean, we're okay with capitalism in the way of going after resources. Let's accept it. The world is colonialism 2.0. That's what it is. It's still the taking of people's resources. But it's just the West deciding what resources it wants to take and not take. And so when we know that these models are incorrect, when we know that this is what these models are doing, why are we still subscribing to these models? That's what doesn't make sense to me. When we're aware, when we look at the model of the United States of America, which is a functioning empire, okay, and the manner in which it functions as an empire, what are we admiring then? The fact that they have power, or the fact that their vision of the world is something we should subscribe to? Because under the watch of the United States of America, I would be very concerned. We have in heightened drugs, we have the nuclear bomb was dropped, we have genocide, we have the wiping out of people, we have a culture of sex, drugs and rock and roll, we have pornography on the internet. You tell me what I should be proud of. Hamburgers, what? I'm confused of what I should be proud of in terms of what the United States of America has given humanity. In this context, we had a vision of how the world should be. There are mistakes, for sure, but this is what concerns me. So what is it that the model that we're trying to subscribe to? In this context, if our model is still going to be one of management, of, yes, you know, we've given you resources and so on, okay, what happens after that? 50, 60, 70, 80 years down the line? What happens next? And as I said, the Syrian nation state has combusted. Iraq is on the verge of combustion, if not combusted. Libya, Yemen. The Palestinian state is a prison. All right, let's be honest, like, where is it working in this context, in terms of the Muslim world? And if we keep saying it's not working right now, we need dictators who will put it into place and we'll fix it later. That's been happening for 70, 80 years. When's the transition going to end? Like, I'm waiting still, and it hasn't happened. And if we're going to present this country as a model and says, yes, well, it's working here, there are tensions here too. Okay, and the migration, like I said, is going to change things in this context. So the combustion of the nation state in one place doesn't just have ramifications in one place. It has a ripple effect of the ramifications around the world. And we've just seen the beginning of this. This migration wave, this combustion, this chaos, this is just the beginning. The assumption is this is the end. Once, you know, we have a free four-state solution in Syria and Iraq, and so forth. No, because the human trauma from this is going to be seismic. And that's why I'm saying I'm concerned about the nation-state model. What are we going to do, continue to create smaller and smaller nation-states? Is that the way forward? Like, the nation-state didn't work, so let's just turn Syria into 5 nation-states. How does it function? And then look at the Syrian identity. I find it intriguing for me, because Syrians are traumatized by the loss of their identity, right? Well, what about when we create these new nation-states? Then we have to once again construct new identities, new memories, new nations on the back end of trauma. And when you see the Syrian flag, which is a colonial project, and then the FSA flag, which is also a French colonial flag, you start to ask yourself, well, where's the memory beyond that? And so this is what happens. Our memories are really short. And it's a memory in my lifetime of just trauma and pain, trauma and pain, trauma and pain. And Islam is being used as a stick. You keep beating it. But I'm not convinced, personally. You know, I'm just not.
Okay. Questions?
Thank you. I have actually a series of questions. I'm not sure. I'll try just to raise some points, and if you care to address them as you see fit. First of all, you know, the question of political legitimacy, which is the title of this talk. I was hoping that you could address where does political legitimacy come from in the age of a nation state. That question hasn't been answered. So if we're talking about political legitimacy that comes from, for instance, voting, or this democratic institutions, we had a conference this past weekend, and it was mostly attended by people who adhere to Islamic ideology. And they started from the prism, or from the paradigm that we accept democracy, actually, when you hear them, liberal democracy. And that we want to see how we can make it better, or at least to fit our context. And there were two views. One wanted to go that path. I was from the other point of view, which challenged even the notion of democracy. Does this democracy fit us? Does it really represent what we want in terms of, or is it a more or less designed to serve colonial objectives? You know, giving it all kinds of evidence for that. But at least, you know, there was a debate. So the question is, what's the alternative? The alternative that was presented, that has to do that we have to change the realities, because these are not real democracies. These are controlled, and they are controlled by bigger forces who have other objectives. And we talked about that. So the alternative would have been, first one, that you have to have certain conditions, things like independence, real independence, real freedom, have will that you can actually execute, equality, and so on and so forth. So the question is here is having these realities. You know, I have people from Granada, for instance, and they were raising good points. You know, we have 11 million people. These people have needs. They need work. They need, you know, we have an economy, and so on and so forth. We have to address these issues. So for us to redesign a new state, so to speak, we don't have that capacity, and they're right. I was addressing more to the countries that can actually do it, and I identified 4, you know, Egypt, Turkey, Iran, Nigeria, and so on. So the question here is going back to the original question. When we talk about political legitimacy, here, for instance, they opted for democracy. Is that the path that Muslims should go? I mean, I'm talking about Muslim Ummah in general. Or should they opt to something more, or better, or different? Or where did it come from if it is not back to the will of the people? Secondly, when we talk about economic system, basically they're adopting capitalism with some Islamic, you know, things. You know, no corruption, no little corruption, so on and so forth. So when we discuss all these issues, I would like to arrive at, and this is actually one of the issues I'm concerned about now, is when we talk about political legitimacy in that context, I need if not the definition, but at least a path towards it. That's the first question.
Do you want me to answer that and then you give me the second question?
I don't want to take the time, actually. I just want to raise one more issue, which you raised about, I think I take issues, so I will need to respond. It's about immigration and assimilation, because history says that, this is the best example of that. You got all kind of communities that come, but they actually get assimilated. Yes, Syrians will have a little bit of Arabic, their children will probably have Turkish. And their children's children will probably have forgotten the Arabic. So, I was consulted, and my view was that Turkey should not actually assimilate Syrians. The same way Palestinians suffered, but they were not assimilated, and they kept at least that spirit that want to go back to Palestine. Not that they get assimilated and then, they're no longer effective in terms of going back.
Okay, so I'll start the second question and the first one. So, no, you're right in that sense, but the Syrian migration is very different from the Palestinian question. In some ways, it's very unique. It's an absolute obliteration. What are they going to go back to? They don't even have the funds and means. And in some ways, the Syrian state itself is already forcing a form of migration into the Syrian space that's taking over the space of the people that have left. In that sense, you're right, I don't agree with assimilation, but the number of Syrians who have arrived in Turkey in that context, the program of assimilation on that group is virtually impossible, if not difficult, especially with that generation trying to maintain their identity in terms of language, food, culture, religion. And also the manner in which the visibility of the ulama is now taking place in Turkey and so forth. So that's why I call it a dialectic struggle. Right? The struggle is on both sides, so trying to find some sort of halfway house of what's acceptable on both sides. Turkey in some ways has been exceptional in, and the Ottoman Empire did this, of taking in migration. And in the sense of Balkan migration and so forth, yes, there is a form of assimilation that happened. But in this case, it seems a very different context in the manner in which the Syrians have arrived and the context in which they've arrived. Now, it's possible that Syrians will be intermarrying and having children who will be speaking Turkish. It's possible. But for a lot of Syrian men, it's hard to get married to a local Turk. And that hasn't changed yet. For Syrian women, the dynamics are a little different. So you have to look at the conditions on the ground. And I personally don't believe that even if there is an attempt to assimilate Syrians, it's going to achieve its objective right now. I just don't think it's feasible now. I think it's a different ball game in the manner in which the migration is happening, with the number of people that have turned up here. And I think there's going to have to be accommodation on both sides to some degree. And this is going to have to be an accommodation of coexistence. And usually in the United States and in Europe, like in Germany, the Syrians that have gone there, the process of assimilation is possible. Yes. But here, between two Muslim entities, it looks a lot more complicated because the language is blurry. The idea of belonging to the Ummah makes it blurry. The idea of more and more Turks wanting to learn Arabic. The idea of the Turks themselves trying to encourage forms of Arabic and so forth. So it's difficult even for this country in terms of what do we accept and what do we reject, what's okay and what's not okay. And it's going to be a constant negotiation between, like I said, a government and its people, with some aspects in Turkish society being very welcoming towards Syrians, and then an aspect within Turkish society that's not so welcoming. And then there's the huge dynamic of the East, and how are Syrians going to fit into that bracket, mixing into the Kurdish regions. How is that dynamic going to play out? And we really don't know yet, because we just don't have the studies on that. We have the studies on the trauma of the war and Syrian identity. What we don't have is the trauma of the war on the Turkish identity with the Syrian migration. Nobody's interested in looking at how the Turkish identity is being hit by the Syrian migration. We really don't know. And that is a study that needs to be investigated in terms of how is it affecting the Turk with this migration of Syrians coming over. So time will tell, but I'm hoping, I guess, to some degree, that it won't be fashioned in the same way as Europe is. And the state is still very different. This is an emotional state. I talk about the state itself. It's an emotional state. It's very different than abstract European states, which can be quite cold. And that's a testimony to the people that are part of this. So in some ways, when we talk about state structures in this part of the world, even here in terms of democracy and the nation state, it's still very different than the way that the nation state was envisaged in Western Europe and in the United States. So this negotiation I'm expecting in this context. And in terms of your first question, the issue of legitimacy, I think we have to ask ourselves what democracy is in the Muslim world. What is it that we're calling for? Are we calling for voting? That people have the capacity to vote in multi-parties and parliament and so forth? Or are we talking about liberal democracy as a concept in which people have the capacity to make certain rules that benefit them? And in a Muslim context, where does that place the Sharia in this context? Now, in the early periods when I was young, there was always a concern by many Muslim and Islamist movements that these two things are not, they don't mix. It's like oil and water, right? And then they started to accommodate them because of the reality that they live in, which is like, look, okay, this is what we have to deal with, this is the situation we're in right now, what are you expecting from us, how we have to survive, and so forth, which is fine. But in some ways, I haven't seen, even in the Western context, there is a fear of neoliberalism coming to an end, that liberalism is coming to an end, and the ideas of authoritarianism, or some form of democratic authoritarianism, is starting to replace them. So if that's shifting and taking place in the Western context, why are we still stuck up in the idea of liberal democracy? We're still like 10, 20 years behind in this context. So we have to really have an honest discussion about what the role of the Sharia is. And I saw some stats which were interesting for me. Like, I was reading the stat about that only 32 or 33% of Turks are actually interested in Sharia being part of the political process in this country. Whereas in Pakistan, it was something like 78. Okay, so here you start to see how the Sharia is understood and what is the meaning of the Sharia. And I know that for many of my students, Sharia is yes and no, do's and don'ts. That's how they envisage it. So when it's envisaged in this shape, it's not envisaged as a philosophy, it's not envisaged as a viewpoint about life, then it's no surprising to me that when you start to see these loaded ideas like democracy being valuized, and then the Sharia being stripped of its value as just a set of rules and laws, that people are going to subscribe to the democratic models. But the democratic models have been problematic even in the West. And if the democratic models are not giving Muslims the form of freedom that they are told that they can practice, i.e. it's very Orwellian, right? That all animals are equal except some animals are more equal than others. That's very clear for a Muslim in the Western context, in terms of what sort of equality we have. And even in the Western context, when we're asking for equality and freedom, what are we asking for as Muslims? Under what station? So when you look at Black Lives Matter, for example, what is it that black people want in the United States? Equality with who? What is it that they're asking for? Because there's been a continuous subjugation of them from white people in the United States and America. And so when they're trying to go past that, what is it that they're going to? Are they still saying, we want to be equal to you in the system that you have, in a manner in which you trash the world? What's happening? So here is still that, even within the Black Lives Matter movement, I think there needs to be some real radical thinking in terms of what is it that they're asking for. They want to be equal towards the people that are subjugating the rest of the people around the world. And this is something that's a concern for me. So we have to have these debates once again, and the Islamists have to have this honest debate once again, which is, if they're afraid to say the word Sharia, if they think that the order of the day is to say the slogan so that you may survive, then just say it, so that we know that you're just playing a game here.
Know how that turned out.
Yeah, of course, exactly. So here, they're going to have to, the tact now has to be different. We saw what happened in that case in Egypt and so forth. I think the younger generation needs something else. And since the trauma of Egypt in particular, that trauma on young Egyptian, educated Egyptians is scary for me. In terms of how many of them are now shifting away from that form of political discourse. So what's happened here? So what do we do now? So that's my concern. If we're going to just see democracy as the execution of certain structural things, then fine.
What's your definition of democracy?
Liberal democracy, I think is an
Islamic democracy, sorry.
No.
Do you think there is something called Islamic democracy?
I think Islamic democracy is an oxymoron in itself. That's just the way I see it. That might be quite childish of me to assume it in that sense. But listen, look, we don't need to say that Islam can be democratic. Islam is just in that context, you know, and it has we don't need to qualify conceptions of constitutionalism and fairness and equality or equity within the language that's been used within the Western structure. Different civilizations and different peoples and different nations have a way of governance in which there is a sense of freedom and fairness. It doesn't have to be qualified within the Western context. So I always argue that equality and equity are different, right? In the Muslim context, we always look at the worldview from the perspective of, if equity, not equality actually. Okay? The reason why I say that is so equality is 4 people need to go on a trip, they all pay 25 tele each, they go on a trip. That's equality. Equity is you still need to pay the 100 tele, 3 people pay 30 tele each, because the poorest person doesn't have much money, he pays the 10, off we go. That's how actually the Ummah functions in that context. And we actually always think within the body, the collective. This idea of Ummah then is important in terms of how we think in terms of the collective. Even when we talk about the ulama, it's always used in the plural context. Right? Whereas when you talk about the intellectual, it's always used in the individual context. In some ways, it's a reflection of a particular worldview in this sense. And so for me, like I said, the Ummah then, understand what that is. We need to start debating about what it means to belong to this body in a local context and in a global context. We should be emotionally attached to one another, we should be spiritually attached to one another, and politically. And only then can the power and the finances, they come later in that context. So if these terms like equality, freedom, liberty, have a different understanding within the Muslim framework, both in terms of the Sharia and the lived experience by the way that the Ummah understand it, then they're just empty slogans for us, if that's what we're doing. So I think we need to really have these discussions about these terms and words now, in terms of what we're using. And do we need to use these slogans? And that's why I said about justice. Is justice universal? Is the Islamic perspective of justice different from the conception of justice from the Western context? And equality. Is it possible that all Muslims collectively can combine and come together and say, let's make alcohol legal, because that's what we want? Is it possible? And because we are a community of submission, one would have to argue you can't do that. It's just not possible. Even if we all agree upon it, every single one, that we all want to commit this haram, every single one of us, can we do it? No. So here you start to see that within the Muslim context, you are still restrained by the transcendent, and that has to be the main objective.
The people who defend, sorry for interrupting. The people who talk about Islamic democracy, I don't think they are trying to make alcohol legal.
No, I'm not saying that. Well,
they are saying, of course, the unchangeable aspects of Islam.
No, but I'm not. That wasn't the point. The point is trying to make is the sum of every human being or every Muslim. There are certain components you can't change. And in the democratic context, you see shifts of up and down. Societies deciding what's okay today and what's not okay tomorrow. So, for example, let's look at the LGBT community. Before, it was an issue of science. We were born this way. Now, with the idea of freedom, they're saying we should have the freedom to do this. The debate is shifting. It's moving. Okay? And so you start to see that within Western context, that societies, within elite, to some degree, can determine what's acceptable and what's not acceptable by them coming to an agreement. We can't always do that because we are a people of submission, and that's important then to understand that. And our political parties need to understand that. And the people that have division need to understand that. And it's okay then that we're going through these moments of difficulties. But that component, then there's no Islam. Then the Islam is gone. Then we're playing realpolitik to some degree. So that's the way I look at it. I could be wrong. You know, maybe I'm utopian, maybe.
Any other questions?
I'm going to venture to comment at this point because you've given us a lot of food for thought when it like philosophically speaking, and I find these conversations about nation state, liberalism, secularism, almost as if you're peeling an onion. So what would you, given that it tends to be more questions than answers, and that it's just kind of a never-ending critique. So practically speaking, what would you tell a young person as far as where to start with regard to sort of resurrecting any kind of Islamic consciousness? Because even in this mode right now, we're still thinking within the nation-state framework, by virtue of being here, by virtue of being educated in the West, etc. And take for one instance, the Da'wah movement, the mosque movement in Egypt, and how that resulted in sort of the nationalization of some of kind of the Islamic scholars within Egypt, and how do you kind of carry on sort of that activity within the nation state that will always try to regulate or control?
I think we need to maintain memories. Memories are important. I'll explain why. So when I look at the works of when you look at the ideas of Mawardi and so forth, they're aware that you know, the Abbasids are on the wane, they're on their way out, they're aware of the possibilities of the Seljuks and so forth. And so what you try to do is you try to maintain a memory. Even when you don't exist, the memory of your idea remains. So that even if it cannot be actualized in your time, the fact that it's still there existing within the consciousness of people, that when there is a possibility of a reality to execute that, then it could be executed. And that sounds really difficult for people in the time who are going through difficulties. Like, how could I explain this to a person in Syria who are watching bombs dropping them? It's virtually impossible to convince them of that. And their requirements are something totally different. In that context, as a privileged academic in some ways, then, I'm talking to the people who have a position of privilege, who have the privilege of information, knowledge, power, and the access to power, to maintaining a memory of an ideal that remains in Muslim societies, so that when the possibility of change comes, that is not gone. Because I tell you something, they're taking the memories away. So we are afraid to say Sharia, we're afraid to say jihad, we're afraid to say khilafah. These words, we're afraid of them actually. And so you stop saying them. Then when you stop saying them, they don't longer become part of your body, and then they don't become part of your consciousness, then they go. And then 2-3 generations down the line, young people look at these words and they're totally alien to them in the literature, in the tradition. Well, what do these words mean? They're afraid of them. So it leaves that consciousness. And then it becomes so abstract that it has no reality anymore, which is one of the things we're saying, which is, what are you talking about? This was 100 years ago, 500 years ago. We now live in a nation state. Because what's different now than the Mongol invasion, the Mongol invasion was devastating. But today there's a humongous psychological war. It's unique in terms of the psychological warfare of maintaining and disciplining the Muslim and disciplining Islam in terms of its ideas. It's very sophisticated in the way the tools are used. So in that sense, just existing is a form of resistance. And these ideas, by maintaining them, is a form of resistance. And that in itself is just as important as any other form of resistance, as a way of maintaining the ideas, so that when a possibility occurs, and when you are trusted by the masses, that this is an honest broker, that the change can take place. It has to be done in this way. There has to be a belief. Now that's, like I said, look, I'm living in this world right now, so I totally understand. And how do I convince the young person? I don't know. How do I convince someone who's seeing all of this? It's really hard. It's difficult for me as a Muslim to also convince the youth who are interested in other things, and it's not their fault, because that's the world we live in. So these are part of the challenges, and then this is why then as a community we need to get creative. Not only on a local level, we've become creative in terms of the way we operate in mosques and what I call micro ummah. So on a micro ummah level, having iftar together and so forth, we've become creative. But on the macro ummah level, in that context of belonging to the large body, of remaining connected, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And this is why it's not only the maintenance of memories, it's then the construction of the possibilities of memories of the future that need to be envisaged as a way of trying to bring about change. So that's the way I see it.
Other questions, comments? Yes.
Hi, I would just ask a simple question. So, what is in your opinion, then the regime which is suitable for Islam, and when is exactly, what is exactly then the source of legitimacy in the Islamic state or country? Are those people which are free and people of 21st century, or is it Sharia?
Well, there's an assumption that Sharia takes away freedom, which I think is a mistake. This is what I mean by words being loaded. So we have an understanding of what freedom is, but we don't have a fair reflection of what the Sharia is in some ways. And this is a problem we have. Look, this is how I saw it in my work, and I'm now just going to put it out there. The idea was that sovereignty belonged to Allah, and authority belonged to the Ummah. Okay, and that's an important component, which means that those in the positions of authority are just agents to execute the authority in that context. The sovereignty belonging to Allah meant that you had to have some form of humility and submission to the one that's above you. And that had to be internalized by all the state institutions. And the authority was to the masses. The objective was to safeguard the interests of the masses. And then you had this idea of having a shura council, which was that somebody should advise those who are in positions of power, and they should be free to criticize, free to think, and free to practice their religion. And they could be non-Muslim and Muslim, it doesn't matter in that context, because what we're trying to do is trying to just have a healthy state and society interaction. And what I noticed, and I saw in my work, but it was blurry, huh? The transitions are not sharp, because once again in today's secularized world, everything has to be sharp. The citizen, the nation, the state, identity, it's always sharp. And yet, I'm saying that life is a bit more blurrier than that. And in the Muslim context, why can it not be more blurry? But the assumption that only a democratic way of life, in terms of the Western models, can give people a sense of fraternity, freedom, tranquility, peace, and so forth, is I don't subscribe to that. I think that can be subscribed to many forms of governance. The regime is irrelevant to me, whether it's centralized or decentralized. Human beings can create problems in both. This is what happens in the Ottoman Empire. In the 18th century, it's decentralized. Local people committed acts of crime. So then they asked for centralization. Then the Ottomans centralized, and then it's the central authority which is doing it. And then they want decentralization again. And this is something that will happen with human beings. So I'm not expecting a utopia or something perfect. But what I'm saying is that there is a certain standard that should exist within Muslim societies, that this is not acceptable. For example, deaths for Muslims are unacceptable. This is something that should be human. Everyone should accept this. One of the interesting things I looked at, for example, is the idea of human rights. And is the Sharia, does it comply to human rights? And one of my friends said, no, the Sharia has humane rights. And I said, human rights, humane rights. Is there a difference? Because of course there is. Because human rights is a regime. It's a worldview of disciplining people, putting religion underneath the banner of humanity. And it places humanity above that. Humane rights is just a form of rights in which there is some form of fairness that can be executed by whatever legal system in that context. So once again, it comes down to how you view the world. And so ideas of human rights, democracy, secularism, what they do is they actually elevate mankind. And when you give mankind that much authority, we become arrogant, because that's just our nature. And then we start doing horrible things, because that's just the way we are.
We have still some time.
I agree with you when you said that modern Islamists have missed or have misunderstood either Islam or the reality. And you talked about this priorities, this missing of priorities in Muslim countries. For example, you have they misunderstood the priorities of youth, especially. So when you talk about them, how do you see, how are they evolving in their priorities today? I mean, in the vision of the future.
I think you have a better answer to that than me, in all honesty. I mean, you are the youth. You're the ones who know what you want and don't want. I mean, for me, I'm not trying to escape your question.
Yeah, but we are commending, we are observing. They are the actors.
Of course. But one of the points I'm trying to make is, it's so hard for someone like me in terms of, and this is my generation, because I feel frustrated by the generation before me. So imagine how you feel by that generation and me, because the things are going so quickly. There's a disconnect that concerns me, and I said this to Professor earlier, that we live in a world of consumerism, so the young generation have become accustomed to consuming. They consume everything. Even knowledge is consumption. So, like, I'm nervous sometimes sitting on this stage, because I'm concerned that it's becoming a one-way direction where I'm given a Friday sermon, where I'm just talking and talking, and it's been consumed and consumed, right? And we have to change that. Your voices matter, your opinions matter, your anger matters. We need to listen to that as a way of trying to find this resolution. And then if I'm going to try to provide you an alternative, then this alternative has to be one of negotiation and debate. Is that happening in our communities? I don't think it is. And it needs to. So, like I said, I honestly do believe that you have better answers here than me in this context. And I'm willing to listen to that. Anything I've said here today is not written in stone, by the way. These are just my thoughts that I'm reflecting openly because I was asked to give a presentation. I'm a really private academic, by the way. I'm hidden away in a corner somewhere. But somehow somebody found me and said that I fit the profile. So, so I gave you my 2 pennies worth in that context. But the idea is that I want to listen to what you have to say. And then we can say, okay, this is what I believe, and this is what I think, and this is how I've conceived it, and why do you think what you think? And why is it that way? Now, I've done a PhD, so clearly I have a particular knowledge base based on my research, but there are people who know more than I do, and that is my limitation and the limitation of human beings. But you guys, the younger generation, are quite creative in the sparks that you have, but you're being contained, you're being conditioned. So one of the interesting things about Egypt was when the so-called initial revolution began and they removed Mubarak from power, the Egyptian people believed we are indestructible. We took down one dictator, we'll take them all. And then the Sisi regime did something really interesting, which is it pulled the rug so hard from underneath their feet and crushed them so aggressively that it made them believe never again. And they internalized that this is never going to happen again. So they went from an exceptional high to an absolute low, which is unbelievable in the manner in which they achieved this. And I'm saying to you as a Muslim, listen, don't take that defeat as a defeat. We don't have to be aggressive about it, but listen, we live to fight another day for the fact that we exist. And maybe we don't win today or tomorrow, but your existence is important. And that's why I'm saying Islam and the Muslim who embodies it, in some ways, is still a form of resistance to the secularized worldview, the nation state, whether we choose to do it or not. Those that are continuously trying to hold on to something, they're going to resist that. That's just the way it is. So that's not going to be easy, because resistance is hard work, right? And like I said, it's psychological, it's intellectual, and those are far more dangerous than bombs, by the way, right? Because that's the real struggle. Like I said, they're taking words away from you. They're defining words for you. They're telling you what you can say. I mean, you're afraid to say Islam. Well, one is afraid to now say Assalamu alaikum in public. You can see where this is going. And so then you have to resist. And we actually respect people who resisted, like Malcolm X, like Muhammad Ali. We respect them because they resisted. That narrative shouldn't be lost either. There's an attempt to take that resistant narrative away from them and pacify them. This is how unique it's becoming. So we have to be sharp here to some degree. That's the way I see it.
One of the issues that we should address today is relationship between Muslim and non-Muslim, and is a reality. And that's why many people speak about the importance of religious dialogue, interfaith dialogue. Maybe that is not something that we may not agree. But they say the issue of this very important issue of relationship between different religions or religion. Better stress on similarity instead of highlight differences. That's how the methodology, that's how, in order to survive in this world, in relation with other people. But in your talk, I noticed, for example, you speak about democracy, as if no single element of democracy that can be in agreement with Islamic worldview or Islamic value and norms here. So how do we, what is your opinion, or how do we deal with this issue? Because the reality is that we have to be with other people, we have to engage with other faiths as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and I appreciate your humility in being kind to me in the manner in which you constructed it. So I don't think there is a contradiction between Muslims and just generally people and interaction with people. When I was attacking the secularized world, one of the points I'm trying to make is that Islam doesn't encourage you to hold animosity towards your fellow, whether that's Muslim or non-Muslim. So this is why I have a concern when transcendence is removed from this, which is Islam is encouraging you to interact with your world and to be a reflection of what Islam is and to have those virtues in the manner in which you interact with people. But I no longer, and I could be wrong here, and this is my criticisms with people who want to do like interfaith dialogue or even clash like Zakir Naik and Didat and so forth, which is, we've gone beyond that. The secularism is bashed every religion known to man. So that's why I'm going after secularism. I'm not going after Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism per se. I actually say that Hinduism doesn't subscribe to the killing of Muslims in India. Hindutva, the secularized political ideology, does. And it's that negotiation of that. And that's what my concern is. Which is when you don't have this idea of a morality which is beyond you and an accountability which is beyond you, it then legitimizes this form of violence. So that aspect of secularity, I think needs to be challenged. And in that sense, I do believe we have to be intellectually violent, intellectually that is, to challenge that idea of the manner in which secularism is the best worldview in the way that we should live. And in that sense, when we look at democracy, the concept of democracy is coming from that vision. I'm not talking about voting and coexisting and so forth. I mean, this, in terms of Islam in particular, this is a given. I'm actually asking for the interaction of Muslims in their space. I'm concerned, for example, in this country where you have Muslim spaces which are isolated communities that are not interacting with the outside community. As a Muslim, you embody Islam in your person. So, just very quickly, in the past you had master-disciple relationship. The Quran was embodied in the teacher. So the way we learned in the past was we looked at the person, we looked at the book, and he embodied them, and we learned it this way. What Europe did in some degree is you took ideas from books. The person was irrelevant now. So, and that's how they look at Quran, by the way, which is, I read the Quran. No, you didn't, because it has to be embodied in the person who explains it to you. And so in that sense, pedagogy in Islam is very different than the way Western academia presents the learning of something. So in that sense, the point I'm making is Islam has to be embodied in the Muslim, and they have to be a reflection of that. And I believe Islam is good. And I have friends who are non-Muslims who like me as a person, I think, and that's because I embody Islam. And you know, it's really unique. Like, I've had these experiences in the West where people will say, you know what, Yaqoob's a good Muslim, he's a good guy. It's strange, even non-Muslims can identify what's a good Muslim and bad Muslim, which is weird because it's not an idea I've given them. So where does this come from? There is some element then within society of what is good that Muslims can display. And in that sense, I'm not talking about the idea of coexisting. I think we have a responsibility for our fellows. That's why I say Islam has to be an alternative. For the fellow humanity to say, listen, hang on a minute, we've tried your model, maybe it's now time we tried ours. And they will say, well, yours is violent. And I don't think that's a moral act that they can stand on anymore. The violence for Muslims that exists, from Daesh and Qaeda, is actually a modern phenomena that reflects more of the secular than the Islamic. Okay? And that's my personal position.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yaqoob,
Thank
for
you.
Obviously, there are lots of things to talk about. We will continue to have this conversation. Thank you very much.
Can I just say thank you very much for everyone for coming today? I mean, I wasn't expecting anyone to be here, so it's really kind of you.
We have
Oh wow, I get it.
for you.
Thank you. Okay. Shall I breathe in my stomach so that I look good in the corner? Thank you very much.
Thank you everybody for coming today.
Thank you.